the West. Now, folk, I grew up with TV shows. The #1 TV shows were the Westerns. People would get off from work, sit down and eat supper, and then turn the TV on and watch 3 hours of Westerns. They'd watch things like 26 Men, again all Western, Hopalong Cassidy, Lone Ranger, The Rifleman, and Bonanza, and Jefferson Drum, Lawman. Some of you probably never heard of most of these shows, but they were Westerns. And in the West of those days, everybody was pictured as carrying a gun. And the sheriff, or the good guy, was usually some square-jawed man. Some of the men were real, men like Wyatt Earp actually was a real lawman, and so was his partner, Bat Masterson. They were real. Some of them were fictitious, but it pictured a Wild West where the western town had some buildings, had a saloon, had a place to store your horses, had hitching posts, had mostly dirt streets. This was the West that I grew up with. Your book showed, your book saw fit to include a whole chapter on the West, particularly the Indians. In the opening vignette, it's not about a person, but about the Indians, that the whites wanted to assimilate the Indians, and they would take the Indians to board, the Indian children away from the parents and place them in boarding schools. And these children were then given white names. They were no longer called Little Feather or Crazy Horse or Rain in the Face, but so they were given white children's names. The idea was to try to make them Anglo, as the saying went, and anglicize them, Christianize them also. Here was the problem, and folk, this is something that most of you probably still do not quite realize. Anytime you try to change something, you always create a problem you did not foresee. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't try to change, but it's like you get sick and go to a doctor and he prescribes medicine. Sometimes the medicine does you more harm than the disease did. Or sometimes the medicine, it can be worse than the disease. The cure, worse than the disease. Anyway, and we're going to talk in a few chapters about persons who tried to reform. And a lot of the stuff they tried to reform we don't even think about today, I don't even care about. Anyway, the United States started new colonies. Now, regrettably, this map does show a lot of it. All right. European countries. France spread itself out in the Middle East here. Great Britain conquered and occupied Egypt. Italy conquered and occupied Liberia. France had Algeria since 1830. And the French also took over much of the Sahara Desert here. Germany tried to get involved. Russia, they expanded eastward in towards Siberia. The European nations began conquest. Today, now, conquest is frowned on. But the Americans did not at this time try to conquer abroad. The American idea was to try to conquer and settle this land west of the Mississippi River here. Now, at one time, conquest was considered a virtue. Today, it is highly frowned upon. Anyway, when the United States moved west of the Mississippi, they bumped into Indians. And I wondered where your book will state this also. It took Americans from the time they arrived in 1607, it took them more than 200 years to conquer the Indians east of the Mississippi. But then it only took 40 years to conquer the Indians west. The Americans came in such numbers that the Indians simply did not have a chance. They're often placed, and we'll talk more about this, they're often placed on unproductive or useless land. And folk, hear this from a white man. the white man did not keep his promises he made to the Indians. I mean, this is historical fact. Time and time again, Indians told you, if you live here, we'll leave you alone. And then the white man would move in and take over. Well, if you move here, we'll leave you alone. No, they didn't. I mean, hear this from a white man. I mean, this is simply fact. They placed them on reservations, which again was the most unproductive, useless land there was. Diseases oftentimes decimated them. But, now for those of you who think that the Indian tribes did not fight among themselves, the Sioux Indians started out in Minnesota, and they were unique among the other Indian tribes. Whereas most Indian women would only have about 2 or 3 babies per woman, and with the health conditions being what they were, that meant the Indian population was declining. Sioux women averaged 6 to 8 babies per woman. You can pretty well guess that the Sioux multiplied greatly. They outgrew what they had in Minnesota, so they knew they couldn't spread east toward white man, so they began to break out and spread into these Great Plains. Now the Great Plains is the area from Texas, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. The Great Plains, you know, wide open areas with few trees and not very much rainfall, but it's not quite a desert. It has enough rainfall to where it's not classed as a desert, but it's not very productive either. But anyway, there a lot of buffalo lived here. The Sioux Indians poured in droves and overpowered the weaker tribes of Indians like everything. And again, they did this at the same time the white man was pouring in. Now, I mentioned buffalo. The Indians in the Great Plains lived largely off buffalo. Again, there were few trees, not a lot of rainfall, but the Indians made their teepees out of buffalo. They made needles out of buffalo with which they sewed their teepees together. I mean, they used buffalo to make water bottles which they carried around, or water jars, whatever, but they were not glass jars, but jars made of buffalo parts. And so much of their life, their whole life depended on the buffalo. It is estimated there were 15 million buffalo on the Great Plains in 1820. By 1890, only 600 buffalo were known to be on the plains. And the governments quickly moved in and passed laws making it illegal to kill buffalo. And today, buffalo are making somewhat of a comeback. But, well, with the buffalo almost completely gone, and even the Indians wouldn't hunt them because they knew that, hey, if we kill them, they'll soon all be gone. So the Indians became dependent on government handouts. And folk, I hope that I'm talking to a bunch of college students who have aspirations to become successful someday. I want to tell you something about government people who live off government handouts. They often lose their sense of pride. And they often become, utterly worthless, useless, unproductive, and they feel like they're useless, worthless, and unproductive. Now again, maybe you're hoping to get some handouts someday. Yes, I'm living on Social Security, partly, but that's because that's the money that I paid into the government while I was working. I'm still working, but that's some money I paid in, and I'm drawing some of that out now, and will. My wife and I will draw it out till the last one of the two of us die. I said, no, we can't pass it on to our children. All right. But anyway, now, the Black Hills. I had a student ask me this morning, regretfully, folk, I don't know. All I know about the location of Black Hills is they're in the Dakotas. I think that they're in South Dakota here. The Black Hills is a bunch of, mountains, small hills that are black in color. But the Indians consider them sacred, and they consider them their territory. Well, gold was discovered in the Black Hills, and this time the government went to the Indians and offered to buy the Black Hills. Now keep in mind, the Indians had no concept of private property, and of course they did not feel like they had any ownership. None of them owned it. Nevertheless, the Indians refused to sell. They said these are sacred. Now at this point, a man named George Armstrong Custer moved in. All right, when I was in elementary school, I read a biography of Custer, and I still remember a lot of it. George Armstrong Custer grew up in Cadiz, Ohio. Don't worry about that name if you've never heard of it. The only reason I've heard of it, my great-grandfather and his father, my great-grandfather, were living in Cadiz at the same time Custer was. So Cadiz's big name to fame is that Custer started out there. From the time he was a child, Custer would say to his parents, "I want to be a soldier. I want to be a soldier." In spite of different political affiliation, his father had voted for the wrong man for president. Nevertheless, in 1856, Custer's father was able to get George Custer into West Point. He did not distinguish. He graduated right next to the bottom of his class, and on his record, he would run in the halls, he would talk out of turn in class. All told, he was a bad student, but he wanted immortal fame. He wanted people to remember his name for hundreds of years down the road. Well, guess what? We do. But here's how he got it. When the Civil War broke out, he distinguished himself. He almost got killed a couple of times. But his cavalry unit was the first cavalry unit to defeat Jeb Stuart. They called him Undefeated Jeb until Custer met Jeb Stuart's cavalry at Gettysburg. And now, Jeb Stuart had gotten out of the way, moved off from where he should have been, and his men were forced to ride really hard back to the battlefield. And they got to the battlefield a whole day late, and they were really tired, with all respects. But nevertheless, Custer's army did defeat Jeb Stuart, and there was no more undefeated Jeb, for Jeb had been defeated. There was no more invincible Lee, for Lee had proven he was invincible. Anyway, Custer still wanted the immortal fame. When the war was over, Custer was upset because he knew he had not gotten the fame that would last. So he went off to fight the Indians. Now, he ran into something he didn't expect. The Indians, meantime, had somehow bumped into each other, and about 3,000 Indians were together. Now, folk, again, the Indians could not survive that way. For one thing, they were not that good of farmers. They could not have a community of more than 200 or 300 people. Nevertheless, about 3,000 Indians were temporarily bunched together, and Custer knew this. Custer split his forces. He and with 277 men went one way. Benteen went another way, and Reno went another way. Reno and Benteen, three of his top officers. So he split his forces in three. In the meantime, Custer has been accused of. Now, folk, it's hard to prove this because none of the men survived. That Custer was looking over the pretty girls among the Indians, hoping to divide them up when the battle was over. This story is told, but whatever happened, the Indians attacked him, and Custer was left realizing, hey, I'm not going to survive this. He sent notes to Benteen and Reno. Benteen and Reno looked at each other and said, there's nothing we can do. They even outnumber us. Who knows if Custer had not split up his forces, but again, Custer had no idea how many Indians there were. Custer and his 277 men were annihilated. It's called Custer's Last Stand. But it really was the Indians' last stand. Well, the United States sent another army in. The Indians, like I said, they could not hold together. They split up again, and the United States defeated them piecemeal. Oh yeah, but Custer, by the way, got his immortal fame. He has not been forgotten to this day, but it cost him his life doing it. Now, by the way, the Indians, they scalped all of the men they killed, except for Custer himself, because Custer had married an Indian. But they instead drilled his ears open bigger, thinking that in the next life that will improve his understanding, that would improve his hearing. He would understand the Indians better in the next life. Anyway, the United States took the Black Hills. Many years later, this is jumping ahead, but the book does too, the Sioux sued to get the Black Hills back. This case is still in court. Now, the government back just about a generation ago, not long ago, offered to give the Sioux Indians millions of dollars to the Black Hills. The Sioux Indians refused to accept. And again, a lot of Americans believe the Indians were treated unfairly. A woman wrote a book called Century of Dishonor, in which she talked about how that the Indians had suffered from broken promises and whatever. Anyway, there were attempts made to get the Indians off the reservation and onto individual farms. I'll talk more about the Dawes Act, and by the way, my mistake, this word act in this case should also be capitalized. All right, the Dawes Act. It gave the Indians 160 acres, and again, it did them more harm than good. We'll talk about this next time. This is so I'll know where to start next time. Okay, class, you are dismissed. Hope to see every one of you back here on Monday. Have a good